Welcome to Was Justice Served, the podcast where we journey back in time to some of the past's most cryptic criminal cases, brought to you by Findmypast. In each episode, our experts take a look at the evidence found in our historical newspapers and records and try to unpick what really happened. We'll be looking at the gory, the heartbreaking, and the shocking cases that gripped the nation. Join us as we uncover some of history's most scandalous crimes. Follow the twists and turns of the trial and ask the ultimate question, was justice served? But don't just take our word for it. Analyze the evidence for yourself. For each episode, you can access the case files, a complete collection of the historical newspapers we've talked about, all online at findmypast.co.uk/wasjusticeserved. Before we get started, this is just a note to say that this is a crime podcast, so it will contain graphic descriptions and scenes that some listeners may find upsetting. Welcome to the second episode in our series. I'm Jen Baldwin, research specialist and professional genealogist for Findmypast.
And I'm David Wilson, Emeritus Professor of Criminology at Birmingham City University. I'm an author and also a TV presenter.
David, today we're going to be diving into the story of a double poisoning, examining whether it was an accident or a much more sinister bid to wipe out an entire family.
And of course, when we say we're going to be investigating that, I reckon we're probably going to be concluding it wasn't an accident.
We'll find out, David. We'll find out if justice was served.
The clock chimes midnight on the 22nd of September, 1887. We're in Victorian-era Surrey, in a small lodge on Crosby Hill, in the fashionable and bustling town of Camberley. Respected local doctor, Dr. William Henry Twort, arrives on his tricycle to the home of gardener Henry Bowles. He'd been called upon just half an hour earlier, woken from his bed by Henry in a panicked state. "Come quick, my wife and son are sick." Dr. Twort enters the house to a horrifying scene. Hannah, Henry's wife, is lying on the floor in front of the fireplace. She is pale, with dilated pupils and a rigid, immovable jaw. Her face twitches and her pulse is faint. Twort knows what he is looking at, what he'd later describe as a person at the point of death. A shrill cry comes from the upstairs of the house. It is young Edward, Henry and Hannah's son. Leaving Hannah lying on the floor, Dr. Twort rushes to the patient upstairs. In bed, the boy is also experiencing violent convulsions. There is black vomit on the walls, the floor, the bed, and pouring from his mouth. Like his mother, Edward's pupils are dilated. His spine is arched, every muscle in his body tensed. But, unlike Hannah, Edward is conscious. Dr. Twort races to ask the questions that any doctor in his position would ask. "Have you taken any medications?" Edward replies that he hasn't. "What have you had to eat?" "Just a little bread and jam for supper." "How about any mushrooms or fungi?" "No, just an antibilious pill to settle the stomach after dinner." Dr. Twort decides to give Edward chloroform to calm him. He leaves the room to fetch it from his old leather medicine bag, but when he returns, Edward is dead. Downstairs, Hannah's convulsions have also eased. Torn between the two patients and with no idea of the cause of their suffering, time has run out for the doctor. His job is now to record their deaths and determine the cause. How did this tragedy happen? From his long medical experience, Dr. Twort recognizes the unmistakable signs of poison. He inspects the home for clues, a container or bottle that might reveal the cause. Upon his arrival, he'd noticed an empty pillbox on the mantelpiece. Now, less than an hour later, the box has gone. He asks Henry about this. He explains that he must have mislaid it. There are plenty lying about the house that he uses to store seeds. At this, he pulls out a box labeled antibilious pills, containing seeds from a drawer. The doctor presses Henry to understand what other chemicals might be lurking in the house, mushrooms or vermin poison, but Henry insists that there is nothing. As the clock strikes in the early morning, Dr. Twart packs his medical case and leaves the Bowles home. The next day, he gives his testimony to the police. He returns once more to Henry's home with a colleague, collecting all suspicious food items from the scene and handing into police custody a bottle of green gage jam, a tin pan containing scraps of food, and a jar containing an unknown treacly substance. Just over a month later, Henry Bowles stands before the bench in Farnham for the willful murder of Hannah and Edward.
Okay, David, first impressions.
Well, my first impressions are obviously points to poisoning. We've got lots of poisons in the Victorian period, and those poisons would become a very common way that murder would be committed. And the difficulty, of course, Jen, is that forensic science, in its infancy, needed to find tests either for the most common poisons that one would discover in a home, arsenic being the most common one, which when it's heated in a tea or a soup becomes colorless, and therefore it can be easily ingested by the poor victim. Arsenic was commonly available. It was in wallpaper. It was in sweets. Some people would take it to keep their complexion fair. Yeah. So the poisons were part of the everyday culture of the Victorian period. Often I've presented the criminal justice system in public lectures and in my writing as being like in a hare and tortoise race. The criminal justice system is the tortoise and the hare is the offender. And offenders evolve their offending. They work out what the criminal justice system can or cannot prove. And clearly, in terms of some of the poisons that were available, arsenic, strychnine, it took several decades for there to be reliable tests that would be able to demonstrate that actually this person died from arsenic or strychnine poisoning. And then, of course, like the hare and the tortoise, the criminal justice system would catch up with the perpetrator. Sure. And then prospective perpetrators, not easy to say in a podcast, prospective perpetrators would then develop their offending accordingly. They'd move on and find a different way. But in relation to this case, I don't think we're dealing with arsenic because of the black vomit. I think we're probably dealing with strychnine. What is Dr. Twart going to conclude about what happens to Hannah and to Edward?
That it is, in fact, poison. And that's what he testifies in.
Does he say what type of poisoning?
It is strychnine.
It's strychnine. So we're looking at seeds from a tree. We've got to remember that quite clearly Henry is a gardener, so he would have access to those kinds of seeds. Strychnine would be used principally as a way of controlling vermin, but equally, again, this common access to poisons in the Victorian period. Small doses of strychnine would also be used medicinally to help with heart murmurs, those kinds of issues. The clue in terms of what one heard in the voiceover was about convulsions. People who will suffer from strychnine poisoning, they would literally bend over in terms of the pain they were experiencing. And so this is not a pleasant death at all. I'm slightly confused though, and so maybe in terms of the trial, that confusion will be clarified. I'm slightly confused about how Dr. Twart, who questions Edward is still conscious. He questions Edward and says, what did you eat? Have you taken any pills? Edward only seems to have eaten bread and jam.
Bread and jam.
And so presumably if he was being administered poison, the poisoning would have taken place when he ate the bread and jam. But what were your first impressions?
So a handful of things stand out to me. And the description provided is straight from the newspaper content and the newspapers of the time, which were, of course, much more descriptive than they are today.
Yeah.
Especially when describing crime or death or something that we would consider to be very violent or something we don't want to hear about. They didn't hold back on their words. And that was partially because they were trying to sell papers, but also just a part of regular society. It was much more about describing that incident in detail and using very descriptive terms to do so, but not from a perspective of trying to mask what was really going on. So the quote from the paper is that there's black vomit on the walls, the floor, the bed, and pouring copiously from his mouth. And that is very, very common type of language for this period.
And this is sometimes called the new journalism.
Right.
And the new journalism was what we would call tabloid journalism today.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, but very standard in the Victorian period.
And about giving salacious detail, about description of the wounds, the injuries, the weaponry that might have been used by the perpetrator on the victim, as you say, as a way of giving... as a way of selling newspapers, frankly. I also find it really interesting, though, because murder is such a subject that's going to drive people to buy newspapers, we begin to learn a great deal about the social circumstances of people who might not have made it into the historical record.
Absolutely. Yeah, newspapers are such a brilliant way to bring in that insight and perspective on especially the lower classes, the working classes, the very poor classes. It's perspective that we wouldn't otherwise have as historians, being able to look back and study what that environment was really like.
And the other interesting piece of detail that was given is that there was a pillbox on the mantelpiece.
That caught my attention as well. So I'm trying to picture being in the perspective of this physician who's running up and down between these two victims, upstairs and downstairs. I think very clearly he was suspicious from the start.
You know, we're very comfortable about using mobile phones. We're very comfortable about using the internet. If you were to go back to the Victorian period, people are going to be very comfortable about poisons, the availability of poisons in their household. And maybe we should give Dr. Twort some credit for trying to work out even then what had happened, in the midst of all of because that. He obviously was suspicious from the start. I'd like to know more about some of the main characters involved, but let's also just take a nod to the place. This is Camberley.
Right.
And what do we know about Camberley at this particular time?
Camberley's an exciting place in this period. It's a fast-growing town. About a decade before they receive their railway station, opens in 1878, and as we all know, when you have access to the trains, you get access to the rail. The railroad makes a substantial difference to the economic situation of the town, which of course then provides an environment, right? The town has a reputation for having healthy air, so that's also a very popular feature. In this time period, the pollution is really intense, right? Factories are going, coal is burning all over the country. The pollution is significant. So people are moving into the area from across the country. And we actually have a quote, David.
Okay, I love a quote.
Love a quote.
What have you got?
The Reading Mercury tells us, Camberley is daily becoming a more favorite and fashionable resort.
So this is the expansion of the suburbs, effectively, because the railroad has gone to that particular town. That increases urbanization of places that had previously been rather sleepy and forgotten because, of course, they were the cost of getting to the urban centres would have been so great. So, so the railroad is changing Camberley. And what do we know, though, about the major protagonists in this story?
So there are three main characters, and they all appear to be a family.
And let's start with Henry Bowles. What do we know about him?
Henry Bowles is 53 years of age when this event takes place. So he's in the latter years of his life. He was born in Easton in Norfolk.
Uh-huh.
He's the head gardener for a doctor, Dr. Muller in Camberley in 1887. For 20 years or so, he's been moving around the country working as a gamekeeper and a gardener in various counties.
Okay. And he is married to whom?
Well, actually, he's not married to Hannah Bowles.
Now, this is where your expertise as a genealogist has clearly come in useful because according to the story that I had heard at the start of this particular episode, I felt we were talking about a husband, wife, and their child, but you're saying that's not the case.
It's not actually the case. It's reported in the newspapers in several different ways. So some of the papers refer to the child, who is Edward. They refer to him as Henry's son, as Hannah's stepson, as Henry's nephew. So the relationships there are actually kind of confusing. Hannah is actually Hannah Piggle. And again, variations there. It could be Puggle as well. She performs housekeeping duties for Dr. Muller.
Okay.
So they share an employer, right? So they're both working for the same man. She's 11 years junior to Henry Bowles. So she's just 42 at the time of her death. But there is no evidence whatsoever that the two were ever married. There's no marriage registry. There's no marriage certificate. There's no mention anywhere in any kind of legal document across the area that they actually were man and wife.
How common would that have been, Jen?
So not that uncommon. It was certainly more common to actually go through with the ceremony. But in this case, she's referred to repeatedly as his wife, and it gives her a bit of an air of respectability, right? She is attempting to live as a wife, which is her job in society, right? To be a wife and a mother. And so they have this relationship. They're publicly known probably and perceived as man and wife, just as you and I did at the start of this podcast. We assume and we listen to this evidence and we go, well, they're living together. They've been together for a long time. They are a couple. They are partners. And they would have been perceived in the same way.
I know I'm asking a stupid question.
That's fine.
But
I'm used to that from you now.
But well, if they were known as husband and wife, why didn't they just get married?
So there's lots of reasons, actually. It could be because they both had relationships on the side. It could be because she came from a previous marriage that was ugly or in some way harmful to her or damaging to her. Maybe she didn't want to go through that legal complication again. But also remember that when a woman marries in this period, she is signing over her entire life to that man. So if she has been married in the past and she's now a widow, for example, it actually is legally more substantial for her, on a positive side, to maintain that status as widow, because she now protects her own estate and her own assets if she has any, versus giving them up to husband number two.
So this is the legal doctrine of coverture, that the woman subsumes her entire legal personality to the personality of her husband, should they be married. And of course, this is what John Stuart Mill in The Subjugation of Women is going to rail against on behalf of women. I know it's a man railing on behalf of women, but
we needed a man to do it for us because we didn't have the legal power to do it for ourselves.
So this is this would be one of the explanations as to why they actually didn't get married. But then, does that leave Edward, their son, in a confusing picture, both legally and, I suppose, interpersonally?
Yeah, so Edward's an interesting character. And at the time of his death, he's 17 years old, so he's considered an adult. He's certainly able to go out into the world on his own by himself and do what he wants to do and try and pursue his life. And there's not much that we know about his background, actually, but we do know that he has a different surname. He goes by Edward Crickmay or Crickway. We believe that he is actually Henry Bowles' nephew, but not his biological son and not biologically related to Hannah. They refer to him as such, but it doesn't appear that he's even a stepson because, of course, Hannah and Henry are not married.
So this is a very non-traditional family you're describing, a real blended, to use that more contemporary word, a real blended family of different people who are almost coming together. accidentally or almost coming together because it makes sense for them at that particular stage in their life to form some kind of association.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, too, that this is a period in which it's not uncommon for multiple generations to be living together to help economically and help people survive and get through every year and the rents and the food and the economic up and downs of Victorian life. It was very common for people to work and not work and lose their jobs on a really routine basis. So the more adults you have working in a household, the better off you ultimately will be as a group.
See, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because you don't necessarily think that way about the Victorian period, which seems to be very respectable, concerned about respectability, would be very much legally based, but that's not what you're describing at all.
Yeah, and in reality, right, that sense of respectability was incredibly important, but you need money to uphold respectability. As one example, in the middle class in the Victorian period, it was very common to have at least one household servant. But how do you do that? Well, you need to be able to pay that person, and you need to be able to clothe her and feed her because that's part of her wages. And you have to have a place for her to sleep every night. So there is a level of income that household needs in order to establish that household servant. You would not be caught dead without a household servant. So then you take in boarders and you take in other members of your family to help support that level of respectability.
So for me, Jen, I think this one's a wee bit more confusing. There isn't, I mean, I said before, and I'm no doubt I will say it again, there's nothing wrong with circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is often the basis on which murder cases are built, and indeed juries have often convicted perpetrators or suspects on the basis of circumstantial evidence. But even the circumstantial evidence is quite weak in this particular case. I think we've got the appearing and disappearing pillbox. That's obviously something that one would point to. We have got the problem of that, well, there is no problem. This is quite clearly strychnine poisoning. We've got the things that Edward says to the Dr. Twart prior to dying. But all we've got really is the fact that Henry, as a gardener, would have access to seeds. He's working for a chemist. I mean, again, that puts another layer of difficulty in terms of being clear-cut.
Actually, it took some time for them to even build a case to try and bring him to trial. So our view of this circumstantial evidence was shared even in the contemporary time frame of when this event took place. They also reported that he was very callous in the days after the murder and didn't really behave appropriately for someone who is grieving their wife and son.
Well, I mean, how does someone behave in the wake of the murder or the death of someone's very close? Are we supposed to behave stereotypically by wailing and
probably yes,
or can one grieve in a way that perhaps might be related to post-traumatic stress disorder or so forth, and therefore appear to be callous, but in fact you're holding on to a great deal of your trauma. I wonder if you know more information about the trial itself, because surely what would have happened is that Henry would have known at the time that he was charged with murder that these things were going to be said to him. Surely he would have had a defense that this was simply a tragic accident, wasn't he? Wasn't that going to be his defense?
The accidental self-poisoning is definitely something that's presented in court as well as a potential reason for these deaths. The testimony kind of comes across that Henry would be worried that Edward would be blamed, that Edward mixed up the pills, and protecting the reputation of this 17-year-old is one of the points that they try to make in Henry's defense during the trial. It's also important to note that both of these people, both of the adults, work for a man named Dr. Hugo Muller, who's originally from Germany, but at the time of this crime, he's experimenting in chemistry. He's an experimental chemist. So he has all sorts of things around his house. And Hannah, as his housekeeper, would have had access to all of that. Henry actually goes into this trial with the defense that Hannah is actually not his wife, but his housekeeper, that he is presenting this relationship with Hannah that's very distant. He also claimed that Hannah was a closet drinker. Henry uses this fact and tries to kind of turn it against her and hold it against her, saying that he would refuse to pay her if she continued to drink. One newspaper report actually describes this relationship between Hannah and Henry as actually quite intense. In the newspapers, this is what is basically presented as the defense. Henry says, she, meaning of course Hannah, was unfortunately a secret drinker, and Bowles, on discovering this, reproached her and refused more money. That night, he heard her say to his son, "I'll take a pill, and as you're not well, you have one also." Shortly after, he hears a thud in the kitchen, followed by the voice of his son pleading for water, and going in, finds him in horrible pain, helpless. He rushes for the doctor a mile away, but help came too late.
Oh, why would she have told Edward to take a pill after dinner?
Remember, Edward says that he's taken a non-bilious pill. So if that's true, it feels like Bowles is leading the trial to think it was something else. But it might have just been to settle his stomach.
She's the secret drinker. And then, of course, Henry just happens to overhear, "Oh, I'm going to take a pill. You should take a pill as well." You know, this is a bit far-fetched, isn't it?
It doesn't feel like a natural way of things happening, right? As much as they were familiar with chemistry and these kinds of products.
That's a helpful way of seeing what Henry's defense is. It doesn't hold much weight for me, I have to say. There seems to be a kind of attempt to undermine Hannah's character. So this would be very common in terms of the world that I deal with, whereby we label this victim blaming. It is the fault of the victim that they end up dead. About the defense tries to blacken the character, destroy the character of the person who's in fact been murdered, as a way either of excusing what happened to them or as a way of saying, don't blame this particular person that's been arrested.
Exactly right.
And say that's putting a lot of it's trying to deflect attention away from this being a murder to, in fact, something that was much more self-inflicted. Do we know if any of that stands up?
Actually, quite the opposite. So there's nothing saying that they didn't have this intimate relationship. In every account reports them as husband and wife. In fact, Hannah actually gave birth to twins in 1884. They sadly did not survive, but she was very much sitting alongside Henry Bowles when that happened. So we believe they were his children.
So she's been bereaved herself.
Yes, certainly.
And so that again would have a long-term impact in terms of her psychology, how she would feel about the world, how she would feel about herself, how she might feel about Edward. Would she willingly tell the young man that is that to all intents and purposes appears as her son, would she tell him to take a pill to help with his bilious stomach, knowing full well that that pill was actually strychnine? That doesn't really hang together, does it?
No, not to me, at least. And of course, this is a period when postpartum depression is not even a phrase, right? That doesn't exist yet. So we don't really know the mental state of Hannah. She could have been quite depressed by this point.
But there's no sense in which, from your research in the newspapers, that Hannah is presented as having a nervous disposition. There's no sense of her mental health being brought into question, is there?
No, not per se. Not until the defense comes into the trial and presents their case. So Hannah is perceived very much from the start of this situation as a good Victorian woman. She is playing the role of wife, even though she technically isn't. She is being of a motherly character to Edward at 17. she is taking care of the home. She has all the duties of the housekeeper. She is definitely doing her best to be a good Victorian woman. She is socially upright. She is playing that role and being that person. Very gendered roles across Victorian England. But then the defense trial comes in and the lawyers turn the tables. They try to play this across as, Henry kind of discovers this and uncovers.
That's very convenient.
Yeah, isn't it? Right? Goes through this process of actually refusing to pay her and saying, if you don't stop drinking, I'm no longer going to pay you as the housekeeper, which angers Hannah and potentially then causes her to poison herself and Edward, just out of spite. Well, let me give you one more piece of circumstantial to kind of feed into that just a little bit further. There's a testimony, there's a piece of testimony during the trial that talks about their relationship very specifically. And Henry states that they have an argument about money because Hannah is accusing him of not contributing enough, that even Edward should leave the home and the boys basically are not pulling their weight. Right? And Henry says that Hannah flies into a rage. So putting her at the absolute opposite spectrum of that gender role of what she's supposed to be, right? Victorian women are supposed to be docile and sweet and kind, nurturing and caring. They are the religious monitors and caretakers of the home. They're supposed to be closer to religion, to faith, to all questions about love and emotion. So if she is perceived by the jury as the opposite of a good Victorian woman, then that victim blaming just continues to move through.
That's a very sophisticated analysis. But we obviously have two people who are in a relationship with Henry who end up dead. You do get the sense that Henry's moved on or is trying to move on, don't you?
I really feel like he's distancing himself significantly from his relationship with both of these people.
Now, as you know, I would say access, means, and motive. So what is the motive?
We know that there is a life insurance policy on Hannah.
Oh, we always like to come back to a life insurance policy.
It's always about the money, David.
It's the money. You follow the money.
There is a life insurance policy. There's a small one, £28 worth on Hannah. None that we could find on Edward, though. So the motivation is maybe less than it would be. £28 is not a lot. It's not going to get him through the rest of his life, certainly. It's not enough to live on for very long, although it will take him a little bit. But I would think if that was going to be his motivation, he would have policies on both of them.
And why? And so, of course, Edward is 17. We started out by talking about how adults coming together, people coming together, that kind of blended, untraditional, non-traditional family unit serves a purpose. Does it break down by the time, though, that Edward is 17? Maybe, as a father, it's quite nice when your kids go. They become a bit of a, drain on resources. Is that perhaps some of the motivation that we might look at there?
Not in this period. I don't think so. I think it would have been Edward's presence in the house definitely would have been as a financial contributor, and likely they needed him to live with them, or they needed someone to live with them in that economical situation. He just provides too much as a full-time earner.
So there's no motive in terms of getting rid of Edward because he's a drain on resources, because he's still useful to the family unit. Yeah. We've got not really motive in terms of the money that would come through the life assurance after Hannah's death. So what else are we looking at in terms of motive?
Well, I'll give you one more classic reason for motivation.
Okay, it's going to be sex. Yes.
There was another woman. Well, we think there was another woman.
Okay, how do we know about this other woman?
So there's a woman who gives testimony at the trial, and she's an old acquaintance of Henry's. She's known him for 8 years and describes how he has pursued her friend Susan in Sussex for over a 4-year period.
Okay. Now, that is a bit of a motivation, but do we know if, over a period of 4 years, had it gone nowhere?
Yeah, it didn't really seem to connect, but 10 days before the crime, he calls for Susan.
Okay.
And we have this lovely quote. "I should like to see her very much. I have a very comfortable situation now and have my son living with me, but I have an old housekeeper down there at Camberley."
So wait a minute. So he's describing Hannah by this stage as a housekeeper to the woman he wants to establish a relationship with.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily, does it? That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to murder Hannah. And he says he's got a very nice situation.
Yeah, it's very comfortable. But he does, and his lawyers argue that it was more of a jest, that it was kind of like, oh, my ball and chain kind of persona. And that this relationship with Susan was more of a flirtation than anything. It wasn't serious. It was just playing a little game.
But Susan herself doesn't give any evidence at court?
No, just this third party.
And does Susan ever emerge into the historical record as far as you can see? Is there any direct quotes from her? No. So that does mean, I'm afraid, for me, that's a bit at a remove, that kind of evidence. We're back into circumstantial evidence. But what I can't understand is if they're not actually legally married, why isn't he just able to move on?
He has assumed responsibility for Hannah and her well-being socially. He is publicly perceived as being a spouse and supporter of these two people. So she has to exit the picture in some capacity in order for him to assume the responsibility for a second woman socially. Something has to happen to split them apart because they are perceived as a unit. And so he can't really take on another woman or just up and leave if he wanted to, because then he's a deserter. And now his reputation is spoiled because he has abandoned the woman that has come to depend on him.
So in an effort to protect his reputation, it's easier if Hannah
just kind of conveniently goes away.
Conveniently goes away, i.e., a secret drinker takes her own life and takes the life of the 17-year-old boy that they've been bringing up as their son.
And probably would have testified otherwise, right? Because Edward was the one in the household who would know the truth of that relationship.
So there's a sense in which Hannah no longer serves any purpose for Henry. He's trying to move on. It may be with this woman, Susan, that he previously knew, but there's a sense in which this relationship or this triangle, this triumvirate had come together. It met their needs at that particular time, but now no longer was satisfying what those needs might be. And Henry has to present that moving on that he would like to do psychologically by getting rid of Hannah and Edward.
And to use your phrase of victim blaming, he is presenting the case essentially to the public in the trial and saying, look at how good I was trying to take care of her, even though she was a closet drinker. I gave her another chance. I was trying to be the good, upstanding citizen, the good man to her, but she kept throwing it back in my face. So he's giving himself an out, essentially, socially.
Do you know, the other thing that strikes me, just criminologically, Jen, is whether we're talking about the Victorian period or whether we're talking about today, 2 women a week in this country are murdered by their partners or ex-partners. That's 2 women a week. So this is a very common criminological trend. Husbands kill wives. Boyfriends kill their girlfriends. And so this doesn't feel, although I'm struggling to find an actual motivation, this isn't criminologically far-fetched that Henry would have taken the life of Hannah. But actual evidence. Do you know, again, this might be a surprise to people listening to the podcast. Often we are in a position, one is in a position that one knows this victim was murdered and the person who committed the murder was that person there. But you don't have any evidence to be able to demonstrate that to a jury beyond reasonable doubt. And I feel a bit conflicted by this case.
We've reviewed the evidence, all the twists and turns. Before I tell you what happens, I want a very firm, he's guilty or he's not guilty.
I reckon he's guilty, but I wonder if there's enough evidence to convince a jury of that guilt.
I would agree, actually. I think he's guilty. I think he did it. But I don't think the prosecution did their job well here. The jury was out for 3 hours.
Well, that would be long in Victorian times.
Right. And they came back with guilty and sentenced him to death.
Oh my gosh. That is surprising. 3 hours is a long time. Usually juries returned verdicts within 20, 30 minutes. So 3 hours, I know, these days, 3 hours would be regarded as incredibly quick, but 3 hours in the Victorian period is a long period of time, and got sentenced to death. So again, that tends, if there's any doubt at all, juries would tend to find not guilty because they wouldn't want the person to be executed. So this is quite a surprising finding.
It is surprising. And we are on the tail end of the death penalty really being applied in kind of broad sweeps across the country. It's not as common as it once was. Certainly, it's not the public spectacle that it once was. And so the hesitation of a jury would have been, I would have thought that this jury would have hesitated much more on that, and maybe had done penal servitude or something.
And of course, public executions disappear in the 1860s.
Yeah.
Journalists would still be allowed in to witness the private ritual of the execution in the later Victorian Edwardian period. And in fact, journalists would be allowed in to see executions in the 20s and 30s as well. So does the execution
As
happen?
you well know, right? A lot of these sentences didn't actually result in execution, and that's what happens here as well. 15 years later, just before the execution is supposed to take place, his sentence is commuted to penal servitude. And then in 1903, a couple of years after that, the king actually intervenes and orders his immediate release. So ultimately, he's completely let off a free man. After serving 15 years in prison.
Why does the king intervene? What happens to him in jail?
Yeah, there's no jail time confession. It is, though, related to one of those organizations that pops up during this period and does a lot of work in this area of trying to kind of bring people back to God, and that's the Salvation Army. So they come in and they work with him, and he converts and takes on that faith, becomes an official member as a denomination, and eventually kind of turns around, right? Turns his life around and promises to do better. And the Salvation Army then goes and advocates on his behalf.
Wow. One of the most moving experiences I've ever had is when the Salvation Army came into Wormwood Scrubs, where I was working, and they played carols on Christmas Day.
Oh.
And to this day, Wormwood Scrubs is a fairly well-known prison in London, and you could have heard a pin drop. The respect that the prisoners gave to the Salvation Army band was quite extraordinary. And I still retain that as a really moving experience. And this would be in the 1980s.
Yeah.
So the Salvation Army's role within British prisons has remained. I think the other thing that you said that's very consistent with what I see with people who've been convicted of murder is how they go about an identity conversion.
Absolutely.
They have to find a way of coming to terms with the fact that they took another person's life. And sometimes they do that identity conversion by finding God. Other murderers I've worked with would become authors, painters, academics. So they find another way of giving themselves a way of being that person who's taken another person's life. And rather than the label murderer being applied to them, they've got another label which is far more palatable. Because, of course, most people, not all people, but most people, even those who have committed murder, are going to be released back into the community, and they've got to have some way of explaining who they are and where they've been.
Yeah, absolutely. Today we see that through university programs in prisons and people, coming out of prison with a master's program or other degree.
Well, Jen Baldwin was justice served.
I hope that our audience that's listening, David, will come to their own conclusions on this one. I think this is a tricky one. But all the evidence is there for us to examine on our own. And I would invite people to really come back to us on this and judge the case for yourself and decide, was justice served?
And here's the gavel. My gosh.
So much power in that gavel. All of the stories featured in Was Justice Served have been uncovered using Findmypast historical newspapers and family history records. Discover thousands of untold stories hidden within British and Irish newspaper pages, delve into the rich details of your own family history, and clip and save your articles in your very own collections on Findmypast.
In the next episode, we're going to be looking at a violent and tragic murder in Suffolk, one of our counties towards the east, and examining who may have had the motive and means to do it.